Yeah, right. Ex Microsoft recruiter.
recruiter at Amazon.
When you're not selected,
Are there bad recruiters? Yes.
that's really hard.
We were at Microsoft together.
It can become very chaotic, so frustrating for every candidate.
It's not that hard.
Hiring manager has already told us, oh, I'd like for them to start as soon as possible. Yeah, wouldn't we
Tomorrow.
all?
Have you ever ghosted a candidate as a recruiter?
No, I don't feel like I've ever intentionally ghosted a candidate. I always treat recruiting like this. One day, like now, I'm going to be looking for a job and I'm going to be relying on a recruiter to be my advocate or to be honest with me and provide transparency and communication. So I always try to treat every candidate as I would hope that another recruiter would treat me. There have been incidences where a candidate didn't get a role and then they would continue to follow up on any other potential roles that I would have that I didn't. Where sometimes that communication, it's not to be rude, but it's kind of like, after you've emailed back and forth a dozen times over a period of months and nothing's really happening, you're not as responsive just because life kind of happens and you don't have anything and you've kind of shared like, hey, I don't have anything in the pipeline right now. Um, and I'm sure that's probably challenging for candidates to hear that because
Yeah.
when you're not selected or a recruiter does reach out to you and then it doesn't go how you had hoped it would with, the goal is to get an offer. Um, you hope that recruiter is still like a friend and someone looking out for your best interest, and you do for a period of time, but then, like I said, like life just kind of happens and you end up with a whole other like handful of candidates that you've built relationships with that might be a better fit for the roles that you're starting to recruit for that is different than what you were recruiting for before.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think a good recruiter does just that. They create a relationship with the candidates.
Yeah.
And you said something earlier too. You said not intentionally, right? And I think, are there bad recruiters? Yes. I think there are recruiters who
Yes.
don't care. I think the recruiters that do care, it's not intentional to ghost a candidate. And it makes me think of when we were at Microsoft together and we had so many positions, we had so many candidates, and we tried our best to make sure that we kept track of every single one, that we were getting back to every single one. And sometimes candidates do fall through the cracks. And it's just that it's not intentional. But I do think that recruiters should do their best either way to get back to candidates because if you think about it, you can even just go into the system and send them a disposition email, right? Like, why are reasons that candidates get ghosted in the process?
I don't know if the right word is even ghost. I mean, like I think that there are recruiters and that do ghost candidates, or I think it's a time management thing. Honestly, like if I think about this wholeheartedly, like being a recruiter, you have to be really diligent about it's almost like project management, right? Like there's so many different processes in recruiting from the time that you get the requisition to how you open the requisition and then having the debrief with the hiring manager and getting on their schedule and like really understanding the position. There's all these different ways that you can tackle being a recruiter. And if you're not a highly organized person or a detailed oriented person to begin with, that's really hard because it can become very chaotic because let's say you're recruiting for all these positions and you have five, screening calls in one day. And then the next day you've got another set of them. And it's like, did you leave yourself time to go through those screens, track it properly, record it, and then also create follow-ups for how you're going to communicate with that candidate. Um, how I look at it is if you get a screening call, right? Because sometimes you just get dispositions. You just get that awesome email of like, oh, sorry, you weren't selected. We're moving forward with another candidate. You don't even get the opportunity to talk to
Yeah.
an actual recruiter, which is so frustrating for every candidate. But when you're looking at 250 plus applications, which in the last couple of years, I think every recruiter, a position opens and you have like 500 applicants. You can't get to every single one of them. Like it's just not possible.
Yeah.
But if you take the time to screen a candidate, it is your responsibility to ensure whatever the outcome is. Maybe during the screening call, you're like, this is not going to be a good fit. If you're not comfortable with saying it in that moment, then you have a due diligence to give them a heads up by the end of the week. Like, don't string them along. Like, let them just know, hey, this one's not going to work out, and you can give them the best feedback you can. And it could be as simple as one of your screening questions that you got from the hiring manager. They didn't have that experience. They didn't have whatever it's going to be. Like, if you talk to a candidate, it's your responsibility to follow up with them and let them know, right?
Yeah. It's not that hard. And ideally, yes, every candidate wants a phone call or an email explaining like what wasn't right about their specific candidacy, right? But even just you can just go into the system and send an automatic email. And you said something early I thought was really helpful for a candidate to hear. You said sometimes recruiters just might not be organized. And sometimes it's just that, like, it has nothing to do with you. It's not that you're a bad candidate. Like, sometimes they're not organized. They're not able to send you a email or a phone call, or they're really bad at organizing the system and sending you a disposition email. What are some of the things that candidates can do to kind of take it into control or take the process into their own control and be their own project manager? One of the things that I tell my candidates is, hey, if you don't hear from me by next Wednesday, or whenever I think that I'll have an update, follow up with me, send me an email. Like, I try to put it into their hands and let them know, hey, this is also up to you to follow up with me. But like, what else can they do?
So I think I follow the same rule as you do. Like I will literally tell them, like if I have a call with them on Tuesday, I'm like, hey, if you don't hear from me by the end of the following week, kind of like a 2 week, like a week and a half, right? So I give them that. And I always make sure, like before I hang up on the call, like, oh, do you have my email? Just to make sure that they're getting back to me. I think there's a couple, like putting it in their hands. And I never want a candidate to feel like they're inconveniencing me because people are looking for a job, whether it's a career change or they applied it doesn't even matter. They applied for a job for a reason. And it's so frustrating to say because you feel like you're relying on the recruiter so much, because you kind of are.
Yeah.
And it's still like it's not a big deal to follow up with them, and it's not, and they should. I wouldn't do it like necessarily the following day, just because the process, I mean, depending on where you work, I mean, our time at Microsoft, the process was so long. We all would love for it to be super fast and super speedy. And the fact of the matter is, it's not really the recruiter that's controlling that timeline whatsoever, even though we're doing our best. Again, where you're recruiting and how the process works, it could move really fast at some companies, but where when we work together, there is steps and you're waiting on other people and other schedules. Like it's kind of laborious at the end of the day and it's exhausting.
Yeah.
Always try to and I do, like, the candidates that I talk to, I try to be transparent, like, this is not going to be a quick process. Even though the hiring manager has already told us, oh, I'd like for them to start as soon as possible. Yeah, wouldn't we all? And
Please.
we're 2 months into it, right? Um, I always try to give them, like, be very transparent of, like, I would love for this process to move really fast, but I just started my screenings. My goal is in 2 weeks that we're going to start scheduling interviews and have a debrief with the hiring manager of who they'd like to move forward with. So in a week and a half, when they follow up with me, and my hope is that they do, I still might not necessarily have a status update. It could still be I'm waiting on the hiring manager.
Yeah.
Um, I think the other thing for candidates to kind of recognize, at least maybe, and you've experienced it too, is There is such a thing as bad and good recruiters. And during this period of time where a lot of different industries went through some major, major layoffs, recruiters were honestly the first ones to go. And ones that were really, really good and that have been doing it for years. And so then the ones that have stayed, um, they might not have even been as experienced as ones that were let go. So now you have a less experienced recruiter that, thank goodness got to hold on to their job. And now they have to take over everything that now 20 recruiters were doing, and now they're down to two or three.
Yep.
And then there was a shift of like, instead of bringing back full-time, recruiters, you bring back vendors. And there's a difference between a vendor and a full-time employee. And I mean, like, and everyone might have a different view on that. Like, you choose to be a vendor at a specific time in your life, and you choose to be, well, maybe some people have a goal of being an FTE, a full-time employee, and maybe you don't. But
Yeah.
when you have a stake in the game, you care, you care so much differently than when you're a vendor. So a lot of these companies that now have vendors, they don't really have a stake in the game. Like, this is a paycheck. This is not like it's a different investment because you don't feel like you're being invested in. You're only going to invest as much as is being invested in you. And as a vendor, you're not really being invested in. You're just being paid hourly. It's a different feel. And so unfortunately, the candidate experience does suffer a little bit.
Yeah.
In my opinion.
I agree with that. And you said something earlier too that I think is important. You mentioned transparency, being transparent with the candidate, letting them know what that timeline is. Now, if a candidate does not get that type of transparency from a recruiter, they can also take it into their own hands and be like, hey, what does the timeline look like? A lot of candidates will ask me, like, what does the process look like? How long is it going to take between a phone interview or on sites? Like, can you realistically set these expectations for me? So I think it is super important also for candidates to kind of take control of the process and help their recruiter along if
Mhm.
they're not getting a recruiter that is necessarily experienced.
It's funny, like, I don't know, like when you do recruiter screens and you turn to them and you say, hey, do you have any questions for me? It's shocking how many don't, because that is a really good time to ask specific things about the hiring manager, specific things about the hiring team to make sure that as the candidate that they're like, is this really a position that I want? But it's also a really good time to be like, hey, what does my competition look like? Like, who else are you interviewing? Obviously, we're not going to give names, but like, what does it look like? What's that landscape? Um, I had a couple of really good candidates where they would flat out ask me, like, hey, I'm curious, I know that you're screening me and you're screening some other candidates. Like, when you look at our resumes side by side, where are those gaps? Like, or why would this person, on paper maybe look better than mine? Like, is there area of improvement? Because that is an opportunity to take things a little bit into your hand because maybe, you can give a little bit of feedback on the resume of like, oh, well, you talked about this and you shared that you had this experience, but I don't see it on your resume.
Yeah.
Um, so I do think candidates need to prepare themselves a little bit more. Like, you get what you want out of that recruiter screen. It's not just us screening them. Like, they need to take that opportunity and treat it like an interview, even though it's not.
Oh, yeah. The best candidates that I've had, I always say this, are the ones that ask the best questions and the most questions. Like, they're
Yeah.
the ones that keep me to the very end of the call. And sometimes we'll go over, but guess what? Like, those are also the ones that get the job.